So, welcome to this week's episode of Tree Lady Talks. Wow, this is going to be a load of fun. I'm here with George Booman, who is a wildlife expert and sculpture artist, and I absolutely have been blown away by his book, Eavesdropping on Animals. George, thank you so much for joining us.
Sharon, it's been a pleasure here meeting you, and thanks for having me on the show.
George, tell us where you are in the world and a little bit about yourself, please.
Sure. I'm talking to you from not quite a mile from, probably less than half a mile from the Yellowstone Park's northern border. That's home, has been for several decades here. And I grew up in upstate New York, though. I grew up around art, I should say. It's probably my mom's a sculptor. And I grew up around the outdoors. There weren't a lot of kids around where I was, so I was naturally spending a lot of time outside and on the lake that I grew up on, and loved those two things in life, art and nature. And they came in and out at different times up until the present, but they're both solidly with me as a way to really enjoy life in our home in a much better way, I would say.
But also, you're really well known for a very unusual talent. So, as a teenager, you went to a pretty weird competition, something we don't do over here because we're so boring. Tell us about that.
Well, as a kid, I think like a lot of children, drawn to animals, but for me, it was particularly what they said. And I was really drawn to creatures I could have conversations with, or at least try to on a very rudimentary level. And so among those species I learned to imitate were turkeys. And those who pursue turkeys, there's a whole world developed around calling contests to call the best turkey or be the best turkey caller. And at one phase, I was involved with these kind of competitions, and did all right. I actually placed second place in New York State, their amateur open division, having not done that before. But interestingly, and this is the real interesting part, I came out of those experiences really wondering what the animals were really up to. What were they thinking?
Yeah.
What were they really conveying with those sounds? So it was quite a tack. I took a turn away from that sort of thing into really wanting to learn from the animals themselves.
So, but for listeners who don't know, come on then, let's do your impression.
Sure. So one of the calls you would have to do for the contest is the wild turkey, the call of the hen, which is referred to as a yelp. Now, in these contests, you can use a device, but growing up the way I did, and I just was the child who never stopped making noises, so I could do it without a device, just with my vocal cords. And then, of course, there were things like clucks and purrs. And of course, gobbles. Now, these are great sideshow Bob routines to get people interested or get their attention. But to me, they have been, over particularly the last few decades, a wonderful entree into bringing people into a new relationship with the natural world.
Yes.
And there are few things like sound that really pull us in to experience things differently. You pipe sound into an auditorium, nature sounds or music, and it completely changes that space. And sound is really powerful that way to use, in my case, to try to educate people about why it is important to listen.
And it is important to listen, isn't it? Because the nature sounds really tell us what's happening. And if you learn to tune into alarm calls, tell us about the alarm calls of birds and how there might be clues on what's happening on the ground, and give us some examples.
Sure, sure. A lot of birds, well, and it's not just birds talking to other members of their own species. It's not the robins just talking to the robins, or the thrushes, or the tits talking to other tits. It's a community level of conversation that, frankly, we are the only ones who are outside of. The deer are listening to the birds are listening to the deer, the fish, the frogs, the insects are being listened to by everyone. So this is stuff that our ancestors used intimately. Many of us, most of us arguably, would not be here today if our ancestors did not use some knowledge of animal language to just get by every day, to stay out of danger themselves. And so, for instance, a lot of birds and small mammals have alarm calls that are differentiated for threats on the ground versus in the air. So I know you don't really like having our our North American gray squirrels in that part of the world, but they have their own language, and it's similar. The similar physics of sound operate both with these small mammals and small birds. So back to birds, quite often a chickadee, let's say, which is a common North American bird, will encounter a threat and it'll say chickadee, chickadee dee dee dee, whereas the number of D's conveys an understanding of how dangerous the threat is to that bird.
Oh, okay. So the scarier, the more D's.
Correct. That's right. And then if this is a really fast-moving predator, say something in the air that could get them really quickly, they emit a very high-pitched C. I can't honestly hear them anymore. They're so high-pitched, and many of us with age can't hear them, but the birds do. And that is kind of like code red. They know to duck into the brush right away. And if you can still hear that sound, or if you see the behavior associated with others hearing that sound, you can know that there is a hawk coming, sometimes seconds to even portions of a minute before it ever shows up.
And so animals are just constantly listening, and birds are constantly listening to each other, on edge, tuned in.
Mm-hmm. Correct. They have to, because their lives depend on it in this, if we want to call it the calorie economy of life. They don't have international supply chains bringing them fresh groceries every day. They are literally making do with what they can find within arm, fin, claws reach. And that's a very stingy economy to live on. And so anything you can do to save energy and keep yourself safe, if we were just running hither and yon at every potential threat, we'd very quickly run out of energy.
Yeah.
So this community communication system allows animals the opportunity to know trouble's coming before it ever gets there. So when the gray squirrel sees a fox, for instance, it does this kind of low chuffing sort of sound.
Yes.
Right, versus something in the air, say you call them buzzards, or red-tailed hawks are a similar species here. You would just hear this very high-pitched, almost like fingernails on a chalkboard.
Yeah.
Right? They're making this higher-pitched sound, which the physics of that sound, as with most high-frequency sounds, they break down very quickly. They're hard to locate. So the animal coming in, who might be the would-be hunter of that animal, has a much harder time finding where exactly they are. Whereas some of the lower frequency sounds, they travel further, they're easier to identify the location, and so that's actually why they do them for a fox, because that sound isn't going to make them any more liable to be killed. It's less likely, because they're up in the tree, that the fox will get them, so they can afford at that point to use a lower frequency alarm call.
That's incredible. And I also was fascinated to hear about the vocabulary of animals and the vocabulary of birds. Of course, you've touched on it there, but there's a study in the book about prairie dogs and the different sorts of sound that they make. Tell us about that particular study. And can you do an impression, please?
It's fascinating. And this is, Sharon's referring to the work of Kon Slobodchikov, who's now Professor Emeritus from Arizona State University. And he studied prairie dogs and his previous major advisor had suggested that in addition to his studies on the social interactions of these prairie dogs, that he look for these vocal qualities. Someone had recently shown that ground squirrels in California have different calls from something in the air versus the ground. So he confirmed, oh yes, that they definitely have that, but he just kept following the data. And what he found was that there was this variability that kept showing up. So he just kept pushing deeper into his experiments with these sounds. And what he discovered was most certainly they had a call for a coyote versus a dog, which was different than the alarm they used for a badger or a human or a hawk in the air. But there was still more. So he kept pushing deeper into it, and what he discovered was that many of these vocalizations also encoded, and I can't do that, they're very high-pitched squeaks, and there are certain sounds you could say, yes, okay, I can hear the difference between the coyote alarm and the hawk alarm. But at some of these levels, they needed computer analysis to actually tease it apart. Just something of that order, very squeaky and quick, and you wouldn't think as a human being with all of our linguistic skills that would say much, but indeed they were not only saying what it was. So the way Kahn framed it as a noun, human, coyote, they were giving an indication of the speed that they were moving, fast or slow, so an adjective, whether they were walking or flying, a verb, and down to the level of being able to differentiate a human walking fast in a green shirt through the colony of prairie dogs versus a short human in a yellow shirt, for instance, walking through the colony. Just remarkable. And it's still, debated as much, but more of the scientific evidence is actually growing to support what he is finding, that these animal communicational tools that they have in their toolkit are incredibly diverse and very specific in many cases. Some of the recent work on sperm whales, etc., is showing much more of the same. So a lot more of us, for us to learn rather than, and a lot much more to pay attention to.
So I love that. So that's one study of prairie dogs where there has been a lot of time and energy and money spent trying to understand the vocabulary of that wonderful species. Imagine if all of our creatures were examined to such an extent. Several things to think about here.
Yeah.
Number one, they are seeing people as individuals. There's a sense throughout the book of recounting tales of like deer, etc., and coyote. When they get to know an individual human, they see them as an individual human rather than a species. So I love that connection. But this is my own musing, is I think through understanding this greater vocalization, aided by computers, perhaps by AI as well in the future to start, bringing together all of this massive data, might it give credence to the pure intelligence of animals? Whereas you've only got to go back 50 years and the mindset was perhaps that they were a lower species and man was at the top. Might it be that with this increasing understanding of the complexity of language and the acknowledgement of seeing us as individuals, that we're kind of leveling out a bit in some, at least academic and intuitive circles? What are your thoughts on the growing awareness of the great wisdom of animals?
It's encouraging to see it growing. So I'll say that. The kind of Cartesian legacy of Descartes that we have that says the animals don't feel pain, they don't think, they don't feel. Those things are out the window, and we're coming back to understand that a lot of our indigenous cultures from across the globe were telling us much more truth than fiction when they describe their relationship with animals and animals to each other. There is a lot more going on there. And as you said earlier in your lead into that point, you you learn it most critically when you get to know an individual from across the species divide. Whether it's a deer or the tits or a squirrel or, and I argue that nature is not in parks. It's not in crown lands. It's everywhere. And the more we study it close to home, the more attuned we become to it everywhere else.
Yes.
So the patterns and things you see closest to home will relate, even if it's different species, to the Masai Mara in Africa, to a place in Siberia, to Alaska, to anywhere else that you travel. And getting to know that individual creature shows you the potential that really exists there.
Yeah.
They do have language. It's not like our language, and it's more, sort of in line with what Darwin said. It's not a matter of kind, but of degree.
Yeah.
They have language in a different degree. We have mental capacities of a degree that are exceptional compared to other species for the things we do. But as I often say to my students here in Yellowstone, every creature is an absolute genius for what it needs to do.
And
you see,
yeah, I mean, an absolute genius. Not just we're talking about language here, but that's quite narrow, because we know as humans that when we're communicating, I mean, we're across the screen. I'm sorry that we're not together, but we're looking at each other and we're looking at body language and we're sensing not just words, but tone and pace. And I think clearly not smell. In fact, I'm really glad that you can't smell what I can smell here, which is my larger golden retriever who is fragrancing the room with the most terrible fart. And I love that. I love that. But I think also the multiple ways of communication, and you write in the book about the incredible talents of mountain rescue dogs, and about one in particular, the way that it uses scent, and you describe it. We're a bit like Pigpen in Snoopy, because I used to love Snoopy as a child. I was obsessed and would draw him with all the sort of flies. But tell us the incredible story of, is it Chapter, the dog Chapter?
Sure. Oh, goodness. And I just saw her Chapter's since passed on, and I saw her owner the other day and gave her a copy of the book, and she was thrilled to have it and thrilled to tell me about her new pup who she's been working with. And it really goes to show you, when you pay attention just to the animals in your own home, domesticated creatures, birds, cat, your dog, despite his flatulence, can teach you a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And in the case of Chapter, this dog is picking up on things that are invisible to us, that are completely outside of our field of awareness. So, for instance, we're shedding billions of skin cells every day, and these are uniquely coded with our personal signature. They're our smell, but we don't smell each other in the way that Chapter can. And we had, we being my son and I, went to the post box at the end of our driveway, and just happened to run into Chapter and her owner, Colette. And she said, "Hey, are you guys busy? Do you want to help me train Chapter?" Well, sure. It's a Saturday. We're free, and let's do. What do we need to do? She says, "Well, my assistant has already walked a trail right from here, and so if you're willing, we want you to walk the same trail. Maybe switch, zigzag a bit around, but just walk the same trail and meet us about a half mile from this point." Okay, that's easy enough to do. So young George and I walked the trail, and we met her assistant, who was at the other end. And then we just waited. And as it turned out, because we hadn't met Chapter, the dog was somewhere else at this point. She wanted to keep it separate from any of the smells that we were presenting to her. Hell had to be new, just like a real-life scenario of finding a lost hiker, for instance. So she brought Chapter in after we had done our walk. Chapter did the route, and then met us, found us without a flaw. No problem. Found actually the person who was her assistant. That was the target individual. And Colette shows me on her GPS the route that Chapter took. So Chapter initially did get confused by young George and I, uh, adding to the smelloscape, if you want to call it that, but then immediately deciphered which scent was the scent she needed to follow and flawlessly took it right to the end. And that was like fascinating. But anyone who works with scenting dogs knows that that's really not that tough for them to do. It would be like saying it's remarkable that we knew it was a stoplight with a green light versus a red one, or something of that order. It's like, this is obvious, this is not tough. But then she tells me a story that just rocked my world.
Yeah.
And
Tell us that.
because we will see grizzly bears, like I've seen a grizzly bear react to a smell. In this one case, it was the remains of a bison, and it was an old carcass. But it was a mile away, Sharon, from the point at which the bear was going up the ridge and stopped dead as if it had run into a door, a plate glass
Wow.
door or window, turned 90 degrees and ran straight to it. We generally don't know a wild animal is doing something like that because we can't see the outcome. We can't know what they have smelled. But in the case of a domestic dog, we know that Chapter, in this one instance, found not a lost hiker who had sadly perished in Mesa Verde National Park, but ancestral Puebloan burials that were between 8 and 1,200 years old.
It's just incredible.
It sort of blows the mind that here's a creature walking along in its daily life and potentially smelling the ancients.
Yeah.
Creatures and events, or who knows what they're really smelling compared to us. And that, to me, even more greatly reinforces the need to listen to them.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the fact that they can smell it, but they're not going around thinking, I'm so overwhelmed. Because we know our brains take in huge amounts of information, and now with
Correct.
technology, there's people, really struggling with focus and concentration because we've got information overload. But it
Mm-hmm.
points to a great intelligence to be able to filter through and work out what's important to them at that time. And
Yeah.
actually, you talk about noticing and choosing to pick out details throughout the book, and how you spent a summer choosing to notice yellow butterflies. What can we all learn from taking a time to notice a particular thing?
Good question, Sharon. And I think off the bat, choosing to, as I think I may have said in the book, I just opened the door to them. I wasn't
Yeah.
studying them. My background's in wildlife ecology. My bachelor's and master's degrees were in studying wildlife. But those studies, as much as they gave me, didn't fully fill the well, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
There was a connective piece that science wants to hold you at arm's length, but we as social creatures ourselves crave a connective, associative relationship. And sometimes just starting to notice what's around you really changes the equation. Say nothing of giving you a diversion when that phone call
Yeah.
went really bad.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you just turn your senses to that butterfly, and where is it flying, and where does it go? What flower is it nectaring on? Simple things like this that put us back into um, perspective, and I would say probably also balance.
Yeah.
So I noticed there are a bunch of different kinds out there, and I just, as I was going about my usual routines for the day, just notice, how many of these did I see? What colors were they? Yellow, or there's an orange one over there, or kind of a burgundy colored one over there. And this wasn't studying in the way of my scientific background. It was just simply opening up to who else is in that community that I usually miss. And it has a beautiful way of opening you up to things that others don't believe are possible. Like, you can't identify a butterfly on the wing, at that distance. Like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
actually, yes, you can. They have a different flight cadence. The flapping of the wings is different for one species versus a very closely um,
Oh, no,
associated
no,
look-alike.
exactly what you mean. Because if I've been doing a day's tree surveying, because I'm a arboriculturalist, and I will, even despite myself, if I'm driving back, I think, oh, there's an Innonotus hispidus fungus on the ash, or there's another one, or there's another one, and I kind of almost don't want to see it because I'm tired and I'm driving. But it's that sort of self-selecting thing that you have, which is absolutely amazing. I'm going to go back a bit now to something you talked about, people being individuals and the absolute cleverness of crows. Tell us
Hmm.
about the story of a lady walking through a park, having a snack, and a crow landing at her feet.
Yeah, I think that one was our friend Shauna, and it was a raven in this
Yeah,
case, which
it
are
was a
very
raving. I'm
closely
so sorry.
relative.
It's a
No, no,
raven.
no. There are differences, but in some ways it doesn't matter because crows are also quite sharp. But
Yeah,
she had left a cafe with a cup of coffee and a scone or some sort of pastry in the other hand, and was heading back to her apartment. Whereupon this raven lands at her feet, and they do this subtle sideways hop, this sort of, I interpret them wanting to engender themselves to you in a cautious way to see if they can't get some payout in terms of food,
yeah,
when in fact, she wasn't going to give it to them. But she said out loud, "Oh, what do you think you're doing?" And at
yeah,
that instant, Sharon, the bird went nuts. It exploded and screamed and jumped into a nearby tree and proceeded to continue screaming at her as all these other ravens then joined it and participated themselves in screaming at her for the entire rest of her walk back to her apartment. And she was befuddled. What on earth was this all about? She'd
yeah,
never had this experience before. Well, right before that first raven flew off, she noticed that it had markings on it. It actually had leg bands and a device strapped to its back. It was part of a research study. But just 2 weeks before that study, myself and a German researcher had trapped some ravens, which is a very difficult thing to do in order to mark them for this study. Very wary. And I had known of one of the other research colleagues' results of these birds knowing how to identify us by our facial features. Even being able to identify us upside down, which is something human beings really can't do. If you see
yeah.
flip someone's
Oh,
face on a
yeah,
magazine cover upside down, it's tough to tell who that
yeah,
is. And so we had caught more than we could handle, and we called out to people to get help. But I had covered myself. I had these. This was catching my neighbors, my friends. I
yeah,
pulled one over on the local ravens to be a part of this study, but I didn't want to be implicated because I knew they could tell my face. But I also
yeah,
was worried that they might know my voice too. So I tried not to talk much, and I invited some friends to try help us get these birds marked and measured and then released before dark so they could find a good roost. Well, Shauna, this friend, was uh, asking all sorts of questions, as you would. Don't you get to
yeah,
experience, handling ravens very much? And it was very exciting. And so she was just full of questions and conversation. And the keep in mind the birds are being held in what they call a handling bag, which is simply think of a pant leg cut off and had a drawstring
yeah,
on it to keep the birds in the dark and calm and relaxed. Well, even though they couldn't see us, it turns out that they were listening.
yeah,
And this has been shown in other species around the world, including elephants, and probably many of the birds in your own backyard might also know your voice. I would be surprised if they
yeah,
don't, especially if you're the one that feeds them.
yeah,
Um, and most likely, what happened was Shauna's voice, in the course of helping out with the marking of the birds, was remembered, and this particular bird was one that was in the room when she was
wow,
helping, and not until she spoke. It didn't scream until she said, "What do you think you're doing?"
yeah,
And that's when everything changed. And it just, again, begs to how far does this go? How closely are they watching us? What are
yes,
they what are they thinking about us? How do they conduct their lives around what we ourselves are oblivious to.
Yeah, we are oblivious. And I think that many people go around, I see in cities, wearing headphones and looking at their phone and stomping about, etc. But they also have, is there not somewhere in the book you talk about intergenerational memory
Yeah.
of individuals as well?
Yeah.
So that they're
Yeah.
passing on this somehow.
There's cultural transmission. We now know that we aren't the only animals with culture. There are very specific ways a raven takes apart a ground squirrel.
Yeah.
There are very specific things you say in the context of finding a snake in the grass if you are a vervet monkey. Many of these things need to be learned, but some of them are innate. And a great example is the coyotes here in Yellowstone when wolves were reintroduced. Wolves are the number one threat to coyotes in a wild situation outside of human intervention. And when the wolves, keep in mind, when they were reintroduced, they weren't just let go here in the park. They were held inside 1-acre pens until they acclimated, and then they were released. The last wolf was killed in Yellowstone by park rangers back in the day in 1926. So for those who don't know, the reintroduction began in 1995. So this is many decades of absence of the top predator for coyotes in Yellowstone. And yet the moment those wolves were put into those enclosures, the coyotes started using a different vocalization that hadn't been heard before. And it turned out that, and I use this, I in fact even started the book with it, that sound it's their word, if you want to think of it, for wolf. And yet all those generations of coyotes that had existed in the park for the last 70 years, or in that period between the presence of wolves, 70 years. And the average coyote is maybe 3 years old, so many, many generations.
Wow.
And yet, the moment the coyote encounters a wolf, they use that call. So a lot of species they have these innate tendencies to vocalize around certain stimuli. They may have to learn, as the vervet monkeys they found in Africa in some of the early studies in the 70s, they might see a root of a tree and make the alarm that's used for a python. And the adults would cuff them or something like that and say, no, that's not it, don't say that. That's not it. This is the situation you need to use it in. And so there's that beautiful, spectrum of what things are born with versus what they learn. Nature versus nurture, right?
Yeah, that's just really amazing. And you also make the sounds that wolves make. I mean, how does a young wolf get a date?
So, yeah, again, these calls are really helpful, and I imitate them, and I encourage your listeners and other
I'll have to go
observers
after
to
you.
Yeah. Do it in the car, do it in the shower. But there's a really important thing about imitating these animals is that it brings that sound, whether you render it well or not, into you.
Yes.
We learn in lots of different ways. And when you try to imitate something with your body, your voice, it could be gestural, the way a crane moves its neck when it's going to preen versus looking up for an eagle, say. As we imitate, and this is very much part of a lot of indigenous dance and ceremony, is to become the animal. So in the case of wolves, I would imitate them, but I usually do it under my breath because in my early days I was doing this to attract them. But the real learning is in not injecting oneself, but observing, but still being active. And so I might do it under my breath. So I'll do it here. I wouldn't do this in Yellowstone, for one, because it's illegal, but I learned a new call from them. And one of those calls that I learned was how a wolf gets a date. Now, a typical wolf howl, if you have an app that has all these mammal sounds on it, let's say, and you fire up gray wolf, Canis lupus, it will have something perhaps like But what that app won't tell you, and we're just barely on the edge of getting back to it, is knowing what that means. And really figuring out what things mean is, it's really helpful to watch when what is normal changes. So one day I was out there listening and maybe imitating under my breath, and I heard this one wolf howl in a way I hadn't heard before. And it went, and I'm like, what the heck was that? Is this the kid who failed out of howling camp? It was just short and kind of modulated and cut off at the end. It just didn't sound right.
It sounds
It's
sort of
because it had a different meaning.
frustrating. Yeah. Sounds like
It is, and it plays, if we look at it from a scientific angle, it actually plays with some of the, again, going back to the physics of sound.
oh yeah.
This is a male wolf. If you hear that, it's him. He's out there.
Yeah.
And what this male does is approach a pack with females that he would like to woo. But if he's caught by that female's parents on their turf, he will get killed. So the game is to try to draw the females to them, but you want to advertise to that ideal audience, right? Not her parents. And so the howls that are often used in these settings are short and clipped, and the wolf moves dramatically as it's doing it. So it'll go to one patch of trees and then it'll move into a gully. So constantly moving in the area, advertising, but not showing itself to be a viable target for retribution. And it makes complete sense, really. And the game comes to fruition positively if the females then leave their group and join that male. And then they get together on neutral ground. It's fascinating. And that all was tipped off to me by one strange version of a howl.
I love that. It's kind of going, I'm over here, ladies. I'm over here. Don't tell your mum and dad. I'm going over to this tree now.
Exactly.
Over here. This way.
Yeah, I've always equated it to kind of like pebbles. Gentlemen who've had this experience of throwing the pebbles to your darling's window on the second floor of the house to just, I'm out in the hedges, just like you're saying. I think her dad's light's coming on in his bedroom.
Oh my God, you brought back
totally
a memory. So when I was 16, my best friend, and she was staying over at our house, lived in the countryside, and she had a boyfriend called Charlie. And it literally was a dark and stormy night, and we were staying in the same room, and it must have been about 10 or 11 o'clock, and I think they'd had a row, and it was just like, dink, dink, dink at the window. And I was going, what's that? I said, Dad. So my dad came in, and he pulled open the curtains. I'm not joking. A flash of lightning. And then Charlie stood there. He had this enormous 80s curly hair, very scruffy guy, looked up, and my dad screamed, thought it was a werewolf. But it was that same sort of dink, dink, dink. It's absolutely fascinating, though, to see the wolf go, I'm over here. Sexy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're not that different, right? And that's why
absolutely.
I think a lot of people think that you got to learn all the bird sounds and you got to learn all the trees and you have to learn all the fungi and all the mammal. No, the answer to that is no. We share enough through our consanguinity, that shared blood and behavior and physiology. All these things actually predispose us to understanding a lot of this without an academic background. And I think that's important for people to realize it's accessible to everyone, and you can get way more out of it than you know if only you just start paying attention.
I love that. And you talk about the practice of stillness. There was one chap who is a lorry driver who would spend about an hour every day sitting in a sit spot and being quiet. And you also talk about taking the practice of going somewhere quiet on your own. And what did you learn Because often when we come out the car, we're going to go on a nature ramble. Off we go. We've got our sort of noisy sort of waterproof clothing on, if you swish, 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 and our chompy boots, and we've got a packet of crisps, and and binoculars and everything, and think, well, there's nothing here. So what
Right.
can you? I know. So what's happening? I'm guessing that things are
Yeah.
listening and just thinking, oh crikey, I'm off. But how can? What did you learn about really sort of moving, following the edge of silence and just
Yeah.
being still?
Yeah, I think, well, let me first start by saying it this way. The most common animal alarm in the world is silence. Now, we don't equate silence to having much meaning because it's a subtle thing. The presence or absence of sound. We sometimes register it consciously, but we definitely register it subconsciously. And when you do manage to slow down, you realize that we have a far bigger impact on our surroundings than we ever believe we do. I have birded with some of the best birders around, and some of them would know every chip note of every warbler and every sparrow and things like this, but they didn't often realize that those notes were in response to us. And so one thing I'll do with students is we'll go into the field and I just make them sit. We'll go pick a spot and we'll sit for at least an hour. Usually, I'll sometimes just set the watch to 60 minutes. And the only instructions are to find a good spot, relax, take off a watch, no time devices. Just this is a place to relax and observe. If you see animals, make a note in a notepad with a pencil or something. And almost without fail, the groups, and this has been done for years, and John Young has done this wonderfully as well with his work in teaching bird languages. It takes about 40 to 45 minutes before you hear the first birds and animals start doing their thing again. And you realize that we don't see anything. How many times have you gone for a hike and you didn't see anything? There's nothing out here.
Yeah.
Well, the communication system in the environment has already announced your approach and arrival, and everyone's taken measures to avoid you. Hence the silence. Until you sit around for close to an hour, you don't see normal reinstated in that particular spot. So then you ask folks, well, how often have you gone and just sat somewhere with no agenda for an hour? And that answer is almost never. And so the result of never having seen a place in a state of normal, of course, precludes us from being able to notice the significance of dead silence. And that was, you mentioned the lorry driver, Rick Bedsworth, was dedicated to his sitting at a sit spot for almost 20 years, every day. And what he came to realize out of that was not only does silence have meaning, it goes much further into this is the kind of silent patch that develops around a hawk. This type of silence develops around a bobcat. This kind of silence indicates a fox versus a coyote. Unbelievable levels of specificity in what most of us would just consider the absence of anything.
Wow.
And what he discovered was by being able to then delineate where the edges of those silent versus normal patches were, when he walked in those, he termed it the honeycomb landscape, and that's the title for the chapter, is when he walked in the wax, not in the holes, but in the wax of the honeycomb landscape, the birds were singing, feeding, squirrels were chewing on nuts, and by virtue of him recognizing the significance of the silence versus the normal, he was treated as one of them. Literally having, this is St. Francis type stuff. You just don't think that any of us could have these experiences where the birds are singing right next to you. Another bird is jumping over your boot to go get some food over here. There's a squirrel on the tree right next to you. It's almost a, you know, a wild version of when in Rome, do as the Romans, right? They recognized in him an awareness of their surroundings collectively, and it just completely changed the way he was able to interact with nature.
And I think also you write towards the end of the book. It's a bit like I love this book so much. I'm just going to hold it up again. Eavesdropping on animals, because you write off talking about the sounds you make. Then you go deeper into the fact that why are they making these sounds and why they stop making the sounds, and the fact that animals are using all of their senses and communicating with each other intergenerationally, culturally. They're recognizing individuals, they have memory, they have strategy. But then you go on and talk about how can we appreciate them, and what we bring to the party. And it's not just, oh, I'm going to go out and I'm going to wear camouflage gear. I'm going to wear really soft shoes and I'm not going to crack a twig. It isn't really just about that. Tell us what it was about for you to feel more
No,
attuned with nature.
no, to me, the highest order experience in nature that I've been able to have, and I think most of us quite literally can have if we want it, is to be recognized for who and what we are and accepted. You know, that's a tall ask sometimes just in the human world. You know, think of the
Yeah.
number of
Yeah.
therapists and others who help folks get through not feeling heard, not feeling seen, not feeling accepted. And this is the root of so many deep cultural rifts of very much the same. Say nothing of another species. Forget a different culture, a different race of human being. But we've built up this barrier, most of it psychological, between us and nature. Nature's out
Yeah.
there. Nature's somewhere else. It's not here. But what I hoped to do with the book is sort of tease apart that no, even when you're inside, you can hear and know what's going on 100 yards, 200 yards away from the house. The animals are watching you through the window. There isn't the barrier even in that sense.
Yeah.
But there isn't the barrier also in terms of being able to commune and find a new relationship back with these others,
Yeah.
these more than humans. And yeah, you referenced, you know, putting on camouflage and wearing soft shoes and not
Yeah.
breaking sticks, and those are the things we typically think of when we go into nature and want to have a close encounter, an intimate experience. But in reality, you even if you look like the tree, you still smell like a human.
Yeah.
Even when you are, you know, in those soft shoes, you're still walking in a cadence that says human, 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 human.
Yes.
So even as a boy, I learned to differentiate the cadence of steps that a squirrel uses versus a deer versus a turkey. They walk differently. So when you walk like a human, you're treated like a human. You smell like a human, you're treated like a human. Until, that is, you recognize individual non-humans and open your individuality to them. And this is a very key concept, is that because we are identified at that most elemental functional unit of life, which is the individual. It's not species. That's a
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
theoretical, abstract concept that we've created. The individual is the interactive component. When you
Yes.
allow your individuality to be expressed to them in a way that you build trust, you can wear, you know, lime green
Yeah.
and big stomping hiking boots
Yeah.
and walk right past that deer, go right past that red stag, and they will look at you and they'll go back to feeding. And that is extraordinary.
So
We,
do you think it's about it's obviously there's a tendency in this particular era in history to think that we have to buy something with money to get an experience. It's not about that. It seems to be about inner work. As you say, if you've got your inner
precisely.
work, it's sort of almost, for those of us who are hippies amongst us, opening up your heart chakra, so I would say in yoga, or just being like centered and grounded and calm, that we're giving off an energy. Because you talk about in the
Yeah.
garden, you were walking by and there were some birds feeding on the path next to you. And then you're in a trance like dreamlike, just relax, just having a nice time. And then you suddenly sort of remembered something else and your energy changed and they just flew away. Do you think there's something about our kind of vibe, our kind of mood that the animals pick up on? That if we're feeling chilled, they're going to be more natural around us? Is there something there that we could speak to?
Yeah, and this is where it starts to get very
This is
interesting and
non-scientific. Yeah,
mysterious. It's
it's
terribly
mysterious.
mysterious
It's
in a
not
way that
science.
we, if you did a chi-square test, a simple statistical test, and compared a group of people who walked in that way versus didn't walk in that way, they would probably show statistically significant differences in their results. The trouble is, as scientists, we always want to explain why. And there are just some things in life in this world that we cannot and may not ever understand exactly why, but we know it works.
I like that.
Someone who has never
Yeah,
experienced electricity sees someone flip a switch and the light comes on. We may
yeah,
not know
yeah,
what leads up to those two events being related, and yet with wild creatures, we know that we don't even have to call it meditation. We don't have to put any language to it. We just say that if you are fully present and using your senses, allowing your senses to pull in information such that you aren't spinning that hamster wheel in your head.
yeah,
We think too much. We talk too much.
yeah,
We focus on ourselves too much. And that in the natural world is a really frightening thing. And we think, well, how they can't see what's going on in our heads. No, they can't, but they can see certainly micro gestures and things that do point to what's going on in our head. And I use the example of Kluger Hans, which was a horse that was just a sensation in the early
oh
1900s
yes,
in Germany and Europe, where this horse could do math. You could tell dates on a calendar. Tell me what the date is 16 days from now. The horse could answer these kind of questions. Toured him all around, fairs and festivals all over Austria, Germany. And now it's referred to as the Kluger-Hans effect in animal behavior, where the observer intimately changes the results of the studied, the individual creature studied. And what they found with Hans was, no, he couldn't do math. He was clued into his handler giving these tiny micro gestures that he himself was not aware he was giving as the horse approached the right answer and knew to stop tapping his hoof, which was the thing that
yeah,
he used to transmit the answer. If the handler didn't know the answer, neither did Kluger Hans. And I think that speaks to a broader bit of world truth that's
yeah,
very timeless, in that we are saying a lot more with our bodies than we think we are. And until we sort of tame, our brains are usually setting the stage for what our bodies are doing. So until we put in that, you mentioned buying something. Well, to get to that stage of being able to really commune with non-human beings, you have to pay the biggest price, which is your time.
yeah,
And not a lot of
exactly.
people are
Yeah,
willing to give time to slow down enough to work through our own busyness and our
yeah,
own messaging campaign that is, in some cases, counteracting what we most think we want to have for an experience. So it's a long way around saying that, you matter, and what goes on in your mind and your thoughts matter because they come out. Even through smell, there's a wonderful book by Greystone called Deer Man. And this fellow who lived with a group of roe deer in France, and that they would read changes in him through their noses. Fright changes the way we smell. The deer would immediately change their behavior toward him if he found something, in one case a snake, that was right there and perhaps about to bite him. So with their super senses, they are pulling in, like Chapter smelling the ancients,
Yeah.
that deer smelling the scent coming out of that man's skin. They're sensing us in more ways just even than those micro gestures. And I think until we put in that time, we don't realize just how that works.
It's incredible, isn't it? And we are meant to commune with the natural world. That's how we've evolved through time. And Richard Louv, who I know you reference in the book and who I've had the privilege of interviewing in the past, talks
Yeah.
about species loneliness
Yeah.
and so many other writers and thinkers talk about how we need that daily interaction with nature, and we can see the effects of that not happening to whole groups in society, the
Yeah.
negative effects, and the anxiety, the mental health, the physical ill health, and behavioural issues. And so, George, we live in a real changing world with AI at the moment. Do you think there's going to be a time where AI is going to interpret what our wild animals and our pets are actually saying?
That's a really good question. And honestly, it already is in a degree. Merlin software is allowing us to hold out our mobile phone and know that there is a Blackburnian warbler singing there, or a sandhill crane, or it's starting down that path of being able to identify species for sure. But I think it certainly will be able to identify potentially meaningful units of sound in ways that can interpret things. My main reservation with it is, though, is it's no good on its own. Data does not tell the story, and data is best interpreted in context. So whether it's you or someone else who's developing it, those things must be done with a heavy adherence to time in the field to help disentangle things. There was a wonderful essay back in, I believe it was 1930s, written entitled "What It's Like to Be a Bat," and it approaches the elephant in the room relative to some of these things about interpreting non-human language, in that because we don't have those sensory systems, because our wings, or our arms rather, aren't wings, we aren't hearing in ultrasonic frequencies, we don't hang upside down to sleep at night with thousands of others close by. The worldview and the contextual nature of language, as we apply it to animals, is tough to disentangle, even from different human cultures, when we don't share culture. So words have different meanings. You know very well, there are words in the English language that mean
Yeah.
very different things in the UK than they do in America, and
Yeah,
you need to be
I'm
careful
not
about.
gonna. I know I'm not gonna sort of have a fanny bag. I can tell you that.
Exactly, that's what I mean.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so there's always going to be an upper bound, and I think it's important that whatever technology and whiz bangetry we put together, we still have to be in association with these others, because still this is something that we hope to enhance our senses with, hope to enhance our experience of a relationship with our dog or a wild animal, but it is no substitute for being in direct contact with them, because there are smells, there are gestures, there are all these other things that, like, there's a great call that ravens use. Now, in most contexts, that is two birds. It's one bird who's chasing another one out of its territory. So if you went just by sound, that's what you would get on your app if AI had done its job. When that's actually a very different call for a golden eagle. When a golden eagle is flying through a raven territory and the raven is chasing it, they will give a call that sounds like this. The notes and the inflection is very uniform, the spacing is uniform. That's when the raven is in the pole position. It's behind, it's in the safe zone. But when it is underneath the eagle, in the contexts I've seen, it gives that other vocalization. So the context matters. What's happening
Yeah.
matters, and you only get that when you're out there. So, yes, AI will, I think, enhance our ability to learn. We're trying to do that now with wolves in Yellowstone. It's one of the first studies to try to do this with wild wolves to understand their language better.
Oh, there we go. There's some language
And
there.
there you go. As if on cue, right?
I
So
know.
that bark might be for the sound in the kitchen. Some people have,
Yeah.
if they paid attention to their dog, know that they have a different bark for the delivery man versus the
Yeah.
neighbor,
Yeah.
right?
That's
And
somebody. That's somebody walking by. I think. Barney, come say hello. Barney, Barney, Barney. Come here, boy. Oh, come on,
right,
click clackety toenails. Here he comes. Yeah,
there he
I'm
is.
just yeah. Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, well, it plays perfectly into it because AI and machine learning has allowed us to listen all the time. Darwin wrote about the barking of dogs. Wild dogs don't bark, is what he said. And that's not true. It's because most of the time people out there are not observing long enough to see a wild wolf or a coyote bark. They know your dogs bark because you're with them, you're living with them all the time. Yet in the wild, they do bark. He got it wrong. It's just he didn't have enough info. But it's in very specific contexts. Barking is an alarm. What does a gray wolf have to be worried about? Other wolves, maybe grizzly bears and humans. And unless one of those is in close proximity, you don't hear that sound. So again, another reason why, more than anything, it's important for us to be out
I
and paying
love
attention.
that. And I also think it's really useful because we've got all these remote sensing cameras as well.
Hmm.
So that, camouflage cameras, and then we can see animals in the wild or we can hear them in the wild as well. But I think that's really good because, on one hand, I'm thinking, oh, the era of Dr. Doodle of Doolittle, we'll understand what they say and then we'll learn this and the other. But I think it could be dangerous too because you need the whole picture because we spoke earlier about it not just being about verbal language, it's about body language, smells, and
Yeah,
a myriad of other things. We talked about vibes, all of that type of stuff. Brilliant.
yeah.
This is fascinating. So what can the reader, the listener, the watcher do who's just your average person? Maybe they've got a small garden or something. What can we all do to get that deeper understanding, George?
You have to start. So right after this podcast episode is over, or maybe you hit pause and come back to it, but the next time you are free, I want you to just step outside your door. Or if you can't leave, if you're in a situation where you're immobile, open the window.
Yeah.
And I want you to just listen and look. What's the first animal you see? What's the first sound, wild sound that you hear? Cultivating a baseline understanding of what is normal for your area is the first and biggest step. Once you're there, our innate curiosity, our own shared ancestry with so many of these creatures, that all comes to the fore and the rest takes care of itself. But we just have to start looking and listening. So, yeah.
I love that because here, this Tree Lady Talks community, this is not about going out and spending money. It's not about going on a great big fancy course. It's just about sticking your head out the window. It doesn't
Yeah,
matter if you don't recognize what it is yet. It's about paying
correct.
attention and
Mhm.
being open. And then curiosity will lead to more curiosity, which is why I do the podcast. Because the more you
Thank
learn,
you.
the more you want to learn. I mean, gosh, this is just
Yes.
absolutely brilliant. That's
It lights up your
brilliant.
day, doesn't it? You
Yeah,
discover something or you find something you've totally missed, and
yeah,
it takes you out of all the garbage that life wants to throw at you. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, these days base the value of something on monetary terms.
yeah,
Well, because it doesn't cost, I'm not getting as much for my money,
yes.
right?
Oh, yeah,
And this is one thing where we have to step into a more ancient and timeless notion of what is value, and a value of relation and understanding and kinship are the real currency of life. And it does apply anywhere and everywhere you go. For instance, I had a student who, she's from here in the States, but she did that bucket list trip, right? She went to Zambia
Yeah.
and wanted to, so badly to see a wild dog. And they were riding along in the safari vehicle, and everyone's looking, listening. The guide is on that seat in the front of the vehicle, on the bumper, looking for tracks and things. And all of a sudden, she has this realization. She says, "Are they over there?" She kind of points off in the distance in one direction, and the guide turns to her and says, he looks, "There they are." "How did you know this?" She says, "Well, the birds over there are doing something similar to what my neighbor's dog incites when it gets loose in the backyard." And I think that is a beautiful concept for people to remember, is that the best exercise and practice you can do for getting the most out of that bucket trip, out of that holiday into the Lake District, or anywhere you go ever, is within a block of home.
Yes.
By paying attention there and sensitizing your own body and system of sensory input to what's going on around you there, you're going to be that much more ready for it anywhere else you go. It's almost a curse, right? We joke about this as our family. It's like, can we just go for a walk? Like, no, there's something over there. And I think I want to see it. It's a ways away, but it's moving to the left, and the birds are doing this, and this seems like magic to people who don't know that it's possible, but it is just simply using our senses better. And it doesn't matter if it's the same species or a different continent. The patterns apply, and I think this is probably one of the important tools in Homo sapiens' back pocket as they populated the world. We are pattern-seeking creatures.
Yeah, we are actually. But I also love the fact you talk about the gifts of diversity, the gifts of perhaps different physical attributes. Some of us have, some see better, some hear better. Some might be hearing impaired, visual impaired, and the different skills that we can bring to compensate for that. And also you talk about sort of neurodiversity as well, and how that can lead to unique ways of exploring parts of the natural world to benefit us all. And we're all about diversity on this podcast, I can tell you, So I thank you for championing that.
It's important.
So,
and it's super important. As a Crow tribal friend said, there is no handicap in our culture.
No.
There's no disabled. There's only alternately able.
That's what I was trying to remember.
Yeah.
I love that, alternately abled. And so, if you're listening to this and thinking, I live in a tower block in the city, and I have this particular issue, this is for everybody. Because you also talk about the value of watching the tiny things. You don't have to pay thousands of pounds to go on safari. You can literally step out your door or go outside and just look at the ants on a pavement, or just observe something small. Because I hear this a lot from my wonderful guests, is the magic happens where the tiny things are. You just start looking more and more and more, and I just love that. It's brilliant.
Yeah, and I would argue it's critical that we look closer to home so that we value our homes for what they truly give us.
Yes.
If you're paying that rent, you're paying a mortgage, as a friend says, you need to get your money's worth.
Yeah.
And part of that is stepping back into relation to all the other living things. Yeah, even if you are in that flat in the middle of the city and seeing seagulls or some other birds flying overhead, ask the question, where are they going?
Yeah.
When did they go? Do they come back? and even that little thing there gives us insight into their world, but at the same time also adds meaning to our world. At the very least, could be a diversion from, the the suffering that we all encounter of our own making and otherwise. So it helps us on all levels, and it's free. It truly is free. But what it's worth is priceless.
This book, Eavesdropping on Animals, does so many things for me. It not only, yet again, shines a light on the glorious diversity and complexity of how animals communicate, but also how we can learn from them, and how in doing so we can really heal and help ourselves and our natural world. George Booman, my goodness me, this was very moving actually, and I really can't wait to see how science and experience takes us all forward for a deeper understanding of the majesty of our wild animals. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for having me.